Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. And I'm really thrilled to be here with Scarlett St. Clair, who, as we were just talking, is just an amazing person and and an amazing writer. And we'll be talking all about your books in just a minute. But before we get to that, I wanted to let you know that we are recording this, and we are live on Facebook, and you can ask questions in either place. Just put your questions in the Q&A, and you can use the chat for any comments or thoughts or that rambling go along that we have when we're thinking and we can't get our questions out fast enough. So feel free to use all the resources, and we'll be taking questions later in our talk. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library who support all of our adult programs. We wouldn't be able to do this without them. I'd like to thank Pam and Katie from Sourcebooks who have made this possible. Sourcebooks is one of my favorite publishers. I feel like they really bring, books that I like, to the fore. It's really nice. They take chances, I'll say that. Right. And I also want to let you know that you can buy Scarlett's book signed from Bank Square Books. I'll put a link in the chat for you for that. And you can buy Blood and Battle and Blood, or any of, I've been thinking Blood and Ashes all day, but I know that's not right. So I'm like, blah, 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 blah. So, and all of her backlist also through the same link. So, I think the signed books are gold. The holidays are coming. Great gifts. So, with all that being said, I want to welcome Scarlett to the Ashland Library and to the Zoom, and to your fans. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here, and I love libraries. I love also the Friends of the Library plug, because I actually worked really closely. I was the Friends of the Library coordinator at my public library, and so we really established that group of people so they could generate real income for our branch. And so I love that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we could not do this without them. And but to get to you, I know that obviously you're a librarian, but you're also sort of almost like a historian, or what do you call somebody who's so much into mythology and what is that called? A mythologist?
I don't know. I'm a librarian, so I do a lot of research, and I just really, I almost minored in history when I was in college, because I took so many history classes, and I've always really enjoyed it. And so, but as an English major, one of the we read a lot of Greek epics, and I just really enjoyed the drama of Greek epics. Everything is so dramatic and dire. And so yes, and but also I find vampire lore very interesting. I think I find anything that is a commentary on our culture interesting. So that's kind of why I delve into mythology.
Well, so we can talk about mythology in a minute, but I want to
sorry.
We know that you had, I'm sorry, you have a cough. Scarlett had a huge book signing yesterday, a bunch of people talked a lot. And so I'm very excited that she's even able to talk today.
Thank you.
So, but King of Battle and Blood just came out, yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes. And it's the first of a series?
Yes.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about it, and then we'll get into a little bit of it without spoilers.
King of Battle and Blood is basically about a woman named Isolde who is kind of forced, kind of chooses to be in an arranged marriage to save her kingdom. And she sort of stumbles into this world, this greater world, the trope of not really knowing what's outside her country. And what she discovers, it sort of changes her whole worldview and her identity as well. So
I found, without, again, spoilers, this story has vampires and shapeshifters and monsters and all kinds of really interesting lore type characters, which I thought was fascinating. But what I thought what I thought was really interesting in terms of like what you had just said about what is going on in the real world versus fantasy is that, people had this fear of vampires, not an irrational one, because that's what we've learned all of our lives, right? But because of all of the assumptions and the fears that they had also had this like deep hatred for them, and a total lack of knowing who they actually were. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I feel like, I mean, anything can be a metaphor. So, I think we can apply this to, I mean, the internet, for instance. The internet can be a form of a. Let me give you I'll give you sort of a. I took a class in college called Modern Monsters, and it talks about horror and how it sort of tries to represent what we feel as a society, not individuals, that it's bad behavior. So everyone in horror movies who is, engaging in the behavior that as a society we dislike, they die in the horror movie. And I sort of feel like vampires sort of represent that same idea for us. They are the representation of everything we don't like in society, and they are evil for it. And so I just think that it's a very interesting dynamic. I think we can look at something like our pandemic right now as a form of vampirism as well. It's something that causes a lot of damage. It's something that we don't understand as much. We're learning about it, and so there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it causes a lot of fear, and rightly so in a lot of ways. We also do this with different cultures. We demonize different cultures because of our lack of understanding, and create really great divides between people and individuals. And so those people kind of embody what we kind of think of as vampires. And my main idea for the role vampires take on in King of Battle and Blood was this line from this book called The Encyclopedia of Vampiric Mythology. And she talks about how all vampires, there are different versions of vampires throughout all cultures, but the thing that they all have in common is that they are the embodiment of what that culture fears. So literally anything can become a vampire. And I loved that. So that's sort of where that idea sprung from, for how these people were going to embody the fears in this world. I was very rambly. I'm sorry. It was very
No, but I think that is a really good explanation of, what you use. And I think it from my perspective, it took it to such a degree, human versus vampire, like, it really made it obvious, I thought, I got it. Like, oh yeah, people are like that. And who is the real monster? That was a really interesting question too. Yeah. Yeah. Like you think that you're like, oh, the vampires are the monsters because they drink blood, but like, who is really the monster here?
Well, I think it's so interesting because in a pandemic world, I feel like some people have been so traumatized that we've lost our compassion and our patience. And we're so quick to attack instead of sit back and try to understand or ask questions. Or it's very bizarre, and it's so painful to watch. As someone who's been highly affected by the pandemic, my dad died from COVID a year ago around this time. It's so painful to watch people not even attempt to be to have compassion for others, or step into people's shoes to even think about how they might feel. And that is, I think that's sort of the end of society, right? Like that's what happens in this world, where humans failed to step into other people's shoes, step into other people's experiences, and understand what they were going through. And they were just kind of fueled by fear. And it's a very sad thing to watch. It's very hard. I've never ever thought that we would be in a position where we had to remind people to be so compassionate, or remind people that everyone is suffering some form of trauma because of what we've been through during this time. It's disheartening for sure. So, but that's a form of vampirism, right? So we're draining people of we're just draining people of like literally everything. There are all kinds of vampires, energy vampires, you know.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's a very, very big metaphor, isn't it?
I thought so. And that's why I enjoyed reading it, because it had all these levels and it was very complex, I thought. Um, I was also curious about how you created those characters. I am totally team Adrian, everybody. No, when you read the book, you'll see what I'm talking about. Um, but they are really complex in surprising ways. And I'm sort of wondering, like, how did they pop into your head?
Well, they just really did pop into my head. That's that's kind of what happened. They popped into my head just arguing with each other, and I thought it's very um I always try to explore like, okay, well, your anger comes from somewhere. Where does it come from? Like what I anytime I write a novel, I ask like, what are your goals and why is that your goal? How did you get to this point in your story? And I just follow that thread of questioning until I find out, you know, how they work. And I really feel like this, like, to create complex characters, you have to focus on emotions. And like, you know, if it's trauma, where does your trauma come from and what triggers you? And you know, I think Adrian has a lot of trauma, and that's what makes him so complex. Like, no one's going to want to take over the world and destroy kingdoms for nothing.
Mhm.
And for Isolde, you know, her determination comes from somewhere. It probably comes from, you know, the loss of her mother and growing up, you know, having these dreams, but also sort of being pushed aside for being different and being more outspoken than others, especially in society where women are told to be quiet all the time. That's our society, right? So I just try to fold in as much of those sort of, they're kind of lived experiences, right? There are things that we can even relate to, like when someone hurts us, we sort of want revenge in our modern way, and some people take it to extremes, but we can always sort of relate to that feeling. So I think as long as you can fold in remote, like, lived experience somehow, then you can create characters that have a lot of depth.
Mhm. So it actually brings me to my first question about the topic for tonight, which is women, agency, and sex positivity. Because I thought that Isolde, well, I guess I think you're writing fantasy. If you're writing fantasy, why wouldn't you create a world where women have plenty of agency and plenty, like, so, because Isolde is a strong, strong character, but she still had to battle the
Mhm.
patriarchy in many ways. And I just wondered as I was reading it, given that you can write anything you want, anything that pops into your head, how did she still have the same battles that we do?
Well, I think that's kind of what I do, though, is I like to try and work toward disassembling what exists in our society through fantasy. So
Mm,
I do this in my Greek series too, where we have to, like, I want someone who comes in at a point where they may feel like they don't have a lot of power and read these books, and by the end of it feel like they can have power and that they found a way to overcome the oppression we feel in society somehow. And because we have those lived experiences in this world, I feel as though I can relate to someone who has to battle that and who comes to a place where she is on top in the end.
mhm,
So it's more so just the goal of creating a character who becomes that, embodies that in the end, embodies like conquering the patriarchy
mm,
basically. But we see it. So from that we can draw our own inspiration and our own, make our own decisions about how we're going to do it, because it's going to look different for all of us as females, right? We're
mhm,
not all going to fight the patriarchy the same way because we don't all experience it the same way. My experience with it is someone saying, "Oh, it's so great, you can be a full-time author. Your husband will support you doing that." And I was like, "That's not how I'm being. That's not how I'm a full-time author, right?"
mhm.
It's also challenging people who talk about, you know, "Oh, you know, haha, you write romance." Like, you know, people
Mhm.
who write romance don't have plots in their novels. People who write romance, like you write romance because you're a woman, right? So the way I battle that is going to be different from a female who's battling, in her workplace, in the library, for instance, when men get hired over women, even though it's a predominantly female organization, like predominantly female profession, but still anytime a male comes in to interview, it seems like they get hired because they're males, and males aren't prominent in the profession, right? So we're all going to handle that very differently. But in the end, I just hope people can see like the steps that she takes to empower herself, because we all have that battle every day. Um, so it's interesting too, because like I did fight with that. I thought, do I want anyone in like the 9 realms to be a queen? Did I want anyone to be queen yet? And a no, because I wanted, while she had, I think a lot of times in society, people try to pretend that women have more power than they do. And this is the same situation where people are like, oh, look at all this power that she has access to. This is like, the people in this world are like, oh, we're imagined. We've given you this imagined power, and here you are. Here it is. And Isolde's like, no, that's not it. But we face that all the time, where people are like, look at all this power we're giving women, and you're actually not. So, how do you see past that? How do you see past that and then actually get to the part where you have real power? It's really deep.
We'll get to some lighter topics, I'm sure. As I was reading this book, all of these thoughts were coming to my head, because I also, as you were saying that, I was wondering, do you think that that this sort of lack of agency, or the need to fight the patriarchy or whatever, is so ubiquitous that we can't really not have it in a book without seeming unrealistic?
I don't know. Sometimes I think if you don't, because it's in some ways, because I feel like everything in our world is built around male power. Like even the witch hunts, that was a big thing for me, is that even witch hunts were basically mostly went after women. Like women were the ones who suffered during witch hunts, because usually a man said like there are witches, and they wanted more power, so they created this thing to make people afraid, and it's always women. So I'm like, okay, well, if that's the case, right, we still do that. Like we're still doing that with like reproductive issues. Like you want like it's just like, so no, I mean, we're still having a conversation over whether or not women should have access to birth control, or like why women have to take birth control at all when it's dangerous for them, or or like why women can't have abortions. Like we're still trying to tell women what they can do with their bodies. So I think it's like, for me, it's almost, I mean, I wish that world existed, but I think we have to still watch women get to a place where they conquer, because we've been in a situation for so long where we're still having to have these conversations. But how do we teach people that? Like, how do we teach women to stand up for those rights, and those simple rights? They're just human rights, right? We can't even give them to minorities who, we can't even give them to natives who's like, this land is their land. Like we don't have that ability as a society, like, or as like white people. I guess white men really don't have the ability to do that. So I think mostly it's just a play in some ways off of that idea of the witch hunts, and like how we still do this. Like we still create witch hunts for people. It really shows how society does not change. But I think people learn a lot from books, right? Like I learned a lot from books, and even in everyday life, like sex, for instance. When you're a kid, if your parents aren't open to talking about sex, as a female, you learn from books. Like I remember reading The Bluest Eye, which is where I learned that people, like women, this is so like TMI, hopefully we're all women here, but I learned like, oh, you have to go, like you have to pee after you have sex. No one ever told me that, but I learned it from that book, which is it's like there's horrifying things in that book, and I read it when I was like 11. But I learned a very practical part of like females like anatomy, and like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's another way that you kind of oppress women, is you don't teach them about sex, and then and then it's no longer a pleasurable thing for women because we're taught it's not supposed to be, right?
Hmm.
It's a very weird world, which is one way that I think Isolde really conquers. And that avenue is that she's very sex positive, and she's like, I'm gonna have sex for pleasure, and I don't care what you say or think about me.
I
I'm
thought that
very
was,
rambly, I'm sorry.
no, actually, that was my next question, because I did think that Isolde was very sex positive. At the very beginning, you learn that she's not going to just be with somebody just because she's been with them. So like, you already know she's had sex with somebody, like, there's not that virgin complex or anything like that. I really like that about her. And I wonder if like all of your characters are as sex positive.
With Persephone, I didn't really go into that very much, but I didn't harp on the virginal aspect of her. But I did feel like she had to be virginal because of the myth, right? But for Isolde, I feel so I project a lot of myself into these characters. So at the point I was writing Persephone, I was definitely discovering who I was who I was as a person, which, I'm 31 years old. I started writing that, I think, when I was 28 or something. And I was just like, I needed Persephone as an outlet to help me understand who I wanted to become. And Isolde is part of me, but she's ultimately who I want to become. She is, I want to become as unapologetic as she is. And I see her as a way for me to learn how to get there. And because as much as I talk a lot about women and rights and being unapologetic, and I want to embody that all the time. But there are things that scare me, right? And I want to become unafraid. And I think that Isolde is my vessel to become unafraid, right? So I see her a lot of times as someone that she is a way for me to take those steps to become that way. When I was younger, when we were in high school, I graduated in 2008 from high school, and at that point we would throw around words and talk about people who were sexual, right? And you call people sluts, and it's gross language. It's very disturbing now. And and I learned later that it's not bad. It's not bad to be sexual. It's not bad to, and but it took not living in my household anymore and taking a step back from what I was told and sort of brainwashed to believe for so long to learn that. And that's not only so I could get to a point where I wrote a sex positive character. When I was writing Persephone, it was the journey of stepping back from being a very sheltered person, right? And learning, how you disengage from that and become your own person. That's her whole journey. I'm sure I was like unbearable at times with like some of the things that I considered my values because my parents said they had to be. I think we underestimate how influential our parents' beliefs are until, we move out, and we don't often reflect on that, like the time that we take away from our parents to become who we're meant to be or who we want to be, because they can really like I love my parents, but like they taught me things that were very wrong, you know.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
And, we probably are teaching our kids things that are completely wrong too.
right.
you,
Yeah.
you just have to try your
The
best.
internet. That is
But
what
yeah,
we're teaching you, that you can fight on the internet and it's wrong.
exactly. There's so many things that we, that they're going to have to figure out on their own. And we didn't have a pandemic growing up, either. So
No. Yeah.
there's a whole new dimension to it. But so let's talk about that a little bit, because I did a program of about a year and a half ago with a bunch of historical romance writers who we taught. The topic was bodice rippers from the 80s.
Yeah.
And everybody here who's probably heard Kathleen Woodwis, Joanna Lindsay, Rosemary Rogers, they were not sex positive necessarily, but so many of us look back at those with like, I don't know if I'd read them again necessarily, but really good memories. So how can you, say that in this time?
How can I say?
How can I say that? Like, how can I say I enjoyed these books back in the day, but know that a lot of stuff was wrong?
It's the context, right? It's like we still make mistakes. Like we're all still learning, like how in a world where, we've been told that this is the example, like this is ideal, we're all still learning like how to respect all types of people. And maybe that will be our whole life. Like maybe that is everyone's incarnation, every life, like every decade, we will be learning like a new way to respect all people and all like the way everyone presents. And some days I think it's getting better, and some days I think it's not. And some days I think it's way more challenging than others. But there's no one that can say that you can always look back on that and give it the context, which is the decade it was written in, right? And respect it for still being something that broke the mold then. It doesn't have to break the mold now because it's not written now.
Right.
It's like everyone who went and read Dune when it became a movie recently, and I was like, that is 60s sci-fi. It is written very different than sci-fi now. Books that were written like The Lord of the Rings could not get, I mean, it probably wouldn't be published now because of how it's written. We don't write like that anymore. We don't even take stories are not even constructed that way anymore. And so yeah, I mean, I feel like that's what we have to do. I'm not going to write the same books in 10 years. I will look back on these books and be like, you could have done better, right? I will respect them though for what they did for me. And I think you have to, a lot of people started with Twilight, right? And people have a lot to say about Twilight. But the beauty of that is it got you into reading. And we talk about that a lot as librarians. Like that is what that you have to respect that a book got you into reading. It may have flaws. We're not acknowledging just because we like something that it doesn't have flaws. We're saying this got me into reading and I appreciate it for that, right? I don't know. I could be wrong too, but I think I think like it's just difficult. It's like I will probably look back and be like, oh, I wish I had done that differently, or I wish I had handled this with more care. But we all just fold in what we are experiencing right now, and maybe, and you never know, honestly, what maybe their publisher said. No, you can't be any more sex positive than that. Like you can't represent this character this way. That you don't know. You don't know what conversations were had behind closed doors. So, I think we have to stop assuming so much. Like there's a lot of assumption that things are done with ill intent right now, when it may just be ignorance. And we're in a society where we think ignorance is bad. But ignorance isn't a bad thing. Ignorance just means that you need to be taught, like you have things to learn. That's okay. We have to be okay with that.
Yeah. I think too that for me, like there's no wrong answer to that question about the bodice rippers and the sex positivity, except for the amount of book shaming that people do. And that comes up to what you had earlier said about, people do put down fantasy and romance and, these genres that are so popular. And why is that? What is the purpose? And how can we be like,
I had an argument with someone one time about how, not an argument, but they kept saying, well, they represent unrealistic relationships. And I said, well, but for you, yes, but you don't know anyone else's relationship. You don't know anything about anyone else's lives, even your friends, like because you don't live in their life, you live your life. And you can't just project your experiences onto someone else or even a book. So we're just in that mode where like there's that, and then it's also this thing where you can't just read for escapism and fun. Like we have and this is in, I feel like, the book world, where if you're really ingrained in it, it almost feels like the books are not fun anymore. And some of them are not meant to be fun, but some of them can be fun, and you can just read for the pleasure of reading. But romances should not be a guilty pleasure. There's no reason for the guilt to be around reading romance. And I remember, I also think it sort of comes from this idea that people have this, the definition they use for plot is, I have no clue, but the plot in a romance novel, a plot is just a series of actions. And plot does not have to be actual action, like an action movie.
Mhm.
Action can be two people falling in love, and that is the purpose of a romance novel. And anytime you have a fantasy romance, the primary plot's probably romance, and that is going to be the center of that book. So the whole primary plot of that book is two people falling in love.
Mhm.
And I think people don't realize that that's still plot. And I don't know when we got away from that. But if you look at everything that becomes popular in our world, it's all romance. It's all centered around romance.
Mhm.
So it's a very odd thing, and I think we're changing it, and I think who's changing it is millennials,
Mhm.
and just people who are on Book Talk and unashamedly like talking about how much they love romance.
Mhm.
And I read somewhere, I had a conversation with someone, and they had expressed that they had had a conversation with someone about how smut was ruining fantasy. And it's bizarre to me that people don't feel like you can have all kinds of books in this world. You can have fantasy without sex, and you can have fantasy with sex, and it's okay, and you can exist in this world together. There are tons of authors, there are tons of books, there are tons of readers. You guys have to recognize that, like, not every book is for you, and it's okay, and there are other books for you. It's very weird. And I may just see so much of it because I'm ingrained in that world, but it's I usually get on my, like, that's my soapbox, like, that romance doesn't have plot,
Mhm.
because it's just it's miscommunication, and it's perpetuated sometimes by people who, or that romance has the same plot, but the only reason you feel like that is because the primary plot is two people falling in love.
Mhm. Right. Right.
And romance is very tropey as well, which is fine. I love tropes. I think tropes are there for a reason, because they're either part of our fantasy or they're real experiences, right?
Mhm.
So what's wrong with a trope? People make that, for a long time people were so angry about it. They were like, these tropes, they're all cliches. And I'm like, yeah, it's okay. It's not a bad thing. We
Some of us,
demonize stuff, and we shouldn't. It's very
I know.
bizarre.
It is. And I was thinking that as you were speaking that the thing that people object to is the sex in those books, in
Uh-huh.
our books, let's say, because
People say it's
that's what they,
grotesque.
or it's mommy
Yeah.
porn, or it's,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, what were you saying?
No, I was agreeing with you. It's weird.
It is weird, but like they can't see the plot because all they hear is there's sex in it, so.
But we have to start seeing sex as part of a plot in a romance novel.
Mhm.
Sex moves a relationship forward, and if you fail to see that, you have to start looking for it. You're going in with an assumption. Anytime you start reading a book with an assumption, that is all you are going to see. And you can conduct this experiment. Just, like, think about this the next time you go out and about in the world. Like, tell yourself, I am going to see, like, some bizarre colored car today. Like, I am going to see lime green cars today, and you will see a lot of lime green cars. It is
Mhm.
the same thing you'll do with a book. If you go into a book and say, like, all I'm going to see is, like, terrible, like, there's going to be no plot and it's just going to be sex, that is what you're going to see. But if you go into this book and you say, okay, I'm going to go into this book and I am going to analyze how each sex scene moves this relationship forward, you're going to see how we use sex as a plot device, not as just, like, frivolous, like, I mean, I love frivolous sex. In A Game of Fate, I have a whole chapter that's called, like, For Your Pleasure, a montage, and it is a, like, it's a play on how they have sex montages in movies, because I
Mhm.
think it's funny, because I'm that person. But, like, it's like, you're gonna see what you want to see, so, like, stop
Mhm.
going into it with, like, subpar expectations. Why would you want that? um I think it, I talk about this a lot because I think it's very close to my heart, because I was someone who used to assume that romance novels had no plot. But guess what? I hadn't read a romance novel.
Yeah.
How can I make that? I was just repeating what people told me, right?
Hmm.
Well, that's uneducated. That is ignorance. So guess what? I read my first romance novel. It was called The Madness of Lord Ian McKenzie. I absolutely loved it. Fabulous. Yeah, Fabulous by Jennifer Ashley. The main character has autism, and the male character, and it's fantastic. It was fantastic, and that was my introduction to romance. And I've just been, I've been. That's all I read now is romance, and I hate reading books that don't have sex.
Hmm.
I just don't want it. I don't want it. I don't want any part of it. And
That's so
yeah,
funny.
so yeah, it's very interesting. I hope
Yeah.
it changes. I think it
It-
will. We just have to keep talking about it.
yeah.
And anytime people come up to us and be like, "Oh, I don't like romance because it doesn't have a plot," I will tell you how it does have a plot. So tell me what the definition of plot is.
It's actions. You just
Yeah,
said that? Yeah, right?
yeah, yeah. I really do think it comes from just a lack of education on the part of, of what romance really is. And it's $1 billion industry. Like romance sells, insanely well. And so people want to read it.
Hmm.
I think we're getting more open with reading it too. It's not something we hide on our Kindles too. So I always say it's ironic that we get made fun of for reading romance when no one talks about men watching porn. But women who watch porn or read romance, it's like a topic. It's like a funny, it's like something to be judged for. And I'm just like
Yeah.
talk about some double standards, man. That is the inequality of our society.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
I'm gonna just jump over to some of the questions that we have. When does the audiobook come out for Battle in Blood?
I don't have a date for it yet, because it's a whole thing. So my audiobook is not published by Sourcebooks. It is published by Tantor. And it took us a little while to find an audio narrator for Isolde. And so now I'm just waiting for them to put it into production and give me a date.
Mhm.
So when I know, it'll be announced on my Instagram.
Okay, awesome. Who's your favorite character to write from any of your books?
Oh, I love all my characters for very different reasons. And I think it's because they all are some part of me, and they all help me work through a variety of issues. So I don't really like have a favorite. I love them all for very different reasons, but I do really enjoy the people who make me laugh. And
Mhm.
so I love like witty banter, and Soren was very fun. I don't know if you enjoyed Soren, but I did, and I always enjoy Hermes, a good Hermes joke.
Well, it's good. I mean, I think that humor is something that I look for in books for sure.
Yeah,
And I have a
definitely.
hard time getting through them without humor.
Yeah.
And I think that was something about Battle in Blood, because I was like, it didn't seem like it was going to have humor at the beginning, but it really did.
Mhm.
It had like these moments where you're like, oh, and then you realize that's just nature. Like people are funny.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's life, right? Like my friends and I, we have a little bit of a weird sense of humor. We are unfortunately all people who have lost a parent, and we always find some way to joke about something that they would say, like our parents would say, and we have moments where, like, I'm sure if people overheard us, they would think, "Oh my God, like these people are nuts." But you have to laugh, and you have to find ways to just be happy in times that are so hard, and it's worth it. It's worth it. And I think when you're writing a huge battle, like you're writing a huge scene that, or a huge book that is kind of depressing and deals with some heavy topics, like the humor is very important. We all have bright spots in our life.
Hmm. Right, even in the darkest times.
Mhm.
What's your favorite trope to read or write?
Oh, I love enemies to lovers, and I, I write a lot of enemies to lovers, but I just love it so much. I love the learning, like, how you're wrong, and the push and pull and the anger, and it makes the payoff, like, to the first kiss or like the first like sexual encounter, like so much sweeter. I don't know if I'll ever be able to write anything that's not enemies to lovers. I hope you're okay with that.
I think we are, yes. I actually think like enemies to lovers has changed so much over the years. Like I remember reading, again, I'm a little bit older than you, like the Harlequins back in the day, and they just hated each other until the last page, and then they loved each other, and you're like, there was no growth there, you know?
I know. Well, even Pride and Prejudice, there is growth, but it does feel like they hate each other until the very end, and you're like, oh my God, come on. Like now we're like 50% in. If they are not like kind of seeing eye to eye, I'm like, no.
Yeah. Which is
Yeah.
good because you can see that they're starting to like each other. They're starting to see some value in the other person's perspective, which is more realistic than that sort of like hate, 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 bang, love.
And there are all kinds of enemies to lovers. You can be like, even like enemies to friends can kind of be that way. Like we have all sorts of, I kind of had this with a podcast one time. They posted something and I addressed it, and then I was on their podcast and they're great people, but we started out as a little bit like a little enemies, like kind of enemies. And then it went like that. I love them. And so I think sometimes it's a great foundation for friendship, just like the initial misunderstanding. And then you start to realize like, oh my God, we're like, we're very opinionated. And so that's where it comes from, so.
It's true. So I'm not quite sure I understand this question. Do you have book 2 main points already planned out, or
Oh yeah. I talk about how I write all the time, which is like I will see scenes in my head and I write those scenes. There are a couple scenes for book 2, which is called Queen of Myth and Monsters. But I'm actually really focused on a Game of Retribution right now, which is it's a touch of ruin from Hades' perspective, but those books have completely different plots. So I'm actually pretty focused on that. But anytime I have a thought for something that's going to happen in QMM, I do write it down because I will lose it. But I'm so afraid for this series, like this trilogy. I get in, even with a Game of Retribution, I get into situations where I'm like, oh my God, what did you get yourself into? How are you going to get out of this? So I really hope I am able to, I hope. I really want to do it justice.
So what you're saying is you're a pantser, not a planner.
I'm both, actually. So what happens, what I have to do, I cannot write unless I hear a voice. So when they start to talk to me, I sound crazy. I write down the scenes and the conversations they're having. And then when I have enough, I plot with that information. But so I do it a little bit weird, but it's always how I have always written. But eventually I get to an outline. I just need more information.
Mm-hmm. You were saying like, oh, I hope I can do it justice, and I just wondered if you had outlined it already to know where it's going to go, or if you were just kind of like, it's going to.
I always know the end of my book, so I do know that, and if I always know that if I have an end, I can question until I get to the beginning.
Well, I will say I loved the end of Battle in Blood. I did not know that was coming. At some point, I did know, but like it took me a while, and I was like,
it's like I know what you're talking about, because even when I wrote it, I thought I knew it was gonna be a division. People were either gonna know or they weren't, and it's exactly that. Like some people are like, this is so predictable, and I'm like, well, I can see, like I would have known because I'm a writer, but I also, it's not really about that, right? It's more so about because it's a romance first, so it's about getting them to the point where they fall in love. The cool part, though, is that no matter what, people are very invested in the characters. So I think that's super neat.
It is. And I actually tend to not like first-person books.
Yeah, me too, actually.
But I really liked this because I felt like we got enough of the other characters through the dreams and through the friends and the conversations that it was great.
Thank you. It had to be from her. I think you know why now, why it had to be from her point of view. But I think in the subsequent books, I can do more points of view, and I'm very excited about that. So.
Me too. I really want to know what's in Adrian's head. I know, like, you kind of know it, but like, I really want to hear from his perspective. How is retribution coming along? Is Hades opening up yet?
I always talk about this in just when I talk about writing Hades. He's so quiet and he's so angry. Slowly. I think I finally hit a stride where I could feel where I felt like he could tell me the story, but it took a very long time. I remember writing A Game of Fate. It took me forever to find his voice, and you'll see like any character that I really do rely on them talking to me so much, because even Anna Maria in the book, she is so quiet, and I think you kind of find out later that we know she's keeping some secrets.
Mm-hmm.
But that's why, like, I can't hear her. I cannot hear her, and I think it's because she's trying to hide, and Hades is no exception. So I do really like, I say a lot, I'm an intuitive author, and I definitely like rely on them talking. So he's finally he's very broody, which is so funny, but I'm annoyed by it right now. And I was not annoyed by it in A Game of Fate, but in A Game of Retribution, I am beyond annoyed. So I don't know what, do with that information what you will.
I am sure it will come across on the page.
I know. I'm just like, oh God, let's get to a part where you're not. He's very for like, I don't know. He's just very, for a god that's been around for a long time, he's very new to relationships, and people always like talk about Persephone. Persephone has a reason to be bad at relationships. She's 24 years old. This is her first serious relationship. Hades is like a age, like he's been around for ever.
Mm-hmm.
He has no excuse. But he is so terrible at it, and he agonizes over it, and I just want to be like, I want to slap you.
Maybe have like Persephone like do a little.
Yeah. I'll have her be like, snap out of it.
A little
Maybe I
moonstruck
just need to
moment.
write that scene and it will be better.
Well, when you have her slap him, I'm sure you'll say, I'll be in the acknowledgments. Mina told me.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. So I want to ask you about we don't have any other attendee questions yet, so I'm going to jump in with another one of mine. Is how does it feel for you to sort of like jump into this high fantasy genre, with the romance, when people like George R.R. Martin are doing it and really not being sex positive at all. In fact, going in the opposite direction, I think. So how does that work for you?
I think again, it's like high fantasy can exist in all different forms, and there's space for all of us to exist. And high fantasy was actually my first love. It's what I wanted to write from the very beginning. I didn't feel good at it. I didn't feel good at some point, like initially, like when I was 13, I felt good at it, and then the world gets in the way, right? And I had a degree in English, and it's just, having a degree in English is just like what it's like to be an author. I would have professors who were like, you are an excellent writer, A plus. And then I would have professors who would be like, you suck, C minus, right? And I'm like, which one is it? Am I a good author or am I not? Right. So I was very afraid for a long time to write an actual high fantasy because I thought I'll be really bad at it. But I think what made me better at it was the sex part. And I just really enjoy writing sex scenes. So I feel like it's just another positive element to the high fantasy world. Now, I will say that, and maybe it's more so a branch of romance than high fantasy, but I was told by an agent one time recently that the like readers who love high fantasy will not get the romance, and readers who love romance will not get the fantasy. And I do think that's wrong, but I think that is an old way of thinking. If you have a preconceived idea of what you think your high fantasy is, which is the George R.R. Martins, you are going to be like, you're going to read my book and be like, what the hell is this? But luckily, we're kind of changing. And I think romance is coming to the forefront as, I mean, it's always been at the forefront, but it's really at the forefront right now where it's sort of like a pop culture thing. It's sort of a trend where this is good and this is something people want. And they've wanted it for a really long time. And the place that it's lived is in the indie world.
Mhm.
And partly where the reason is like indies are coming up against that wall where traditional publishing is saying there's no place to market this, but one person was doing it and it's Sarah J. Maas, right?
Mhm.
But you're being told that you have to do what Sarah J. Maas did. You have to start in YA and prove yourself and then move into adult. I don't think that's true. I think JLA's proved that, and I think I have proved that. But it's not a new genre, but it's something that's thrived in indie publishing. And
Can
the
I-
thing,
one question.
oh yeah,
JLA to me means Justice League of America. What does
oh
it mean to
Jennifer
you?
L. Armentrout. Sorry, that's a Jennifer with From Blood and Ash, right? You know, and so I think like that's sort of where we're going. The thing that Sourcebooks does so well is that they do actually listen to readers, and I think that sometimes traditional publishing gets so far away from that that they're not actually listening to what readers want, and that's what librarians do so well. Librarians know what readers want,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting, but that's kind of how I feel about it. I'm like, maybe it is more of a subgenre of romance more than it is fantasy, but there's space for it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's just going to get bigger, honestly.
Yeah.
Because,
Um,
oh, someone did tell me the other day, you know, because YA, all of us who were young adults when like fantasy was big in YA, we're all older now. So we want our fantasy, but we are older. So we want the sex, right?
mhm.
So it's also part of being a generation that's grown up.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I
I
mean,
really liked that. I was like, yes, you are right.
right, because you grew up like if you grew up 2008, then Twilight was coming out, Hunger Games, all of those sort of like fantasy romances
Yeah.
and becoming
Yeah. And
movies.
now we're 31 and we want, and this is the same case, you know, remember as librarians when NA, new adult, became a thing, and
Hmm.
librarians were kind of mad about it because they were you either were on it or you weren't, and you were like, it's just adult romance. But what it was is a bunch of people who were that age, you know, 18 to 26, who were saying, where is my fantasy with sex? That's
Hmm.
what we were saying.
Right.
So I just think that they kind of are behind, but we're catching up.
We'll get there.
We'll
So,
get there.
just a couple of questions. Do you consider your books fantasy with romance or romance with fantasy? And how did you come to write in this specific genre? Any plans to branch out into other genres?
I look at the primary plot, and I think my primary plot changes as the series goes on. So first book's always primarily romance. And then as we go farther, it probably, like especially with King of Battle and Blood, primary plot is romance. So the first book is romance. I'm thinking second and third primary plot will be fantasy. And I think you can change. I think that you can flip flop that.
Mhm.
I came to write in this genre, which we call romantasy in the book world.
Love that.
Yeah. Because I don't actually know. It started with a touch of, well, actually when Stars Come Out, it's more of like an urban fantasy. It was a YA. But when I wrote A Touch of Darkness, I just wrote what I wanted to write. Like I wrote what I wanted to see out in the world. And
Mhm.
it just happened to be like a romantasy essentially, because it's like an otherworld fantasy. It's like based on our world but different, and it worked. And so then I had the idea for KBB, mostly because the characters were really loud. I can see, I have an idea, a really strong idea for a like adult sci-fi with a lot of sex, of course, which I'm very excited about because it sort of plays upon I am native, so it plays upon the history of having your land taken from you. And the Gemma is the main character, and she's very connected. Her grandma is very connected to the earth, and so is she. And they can sort of feel the pain that their planet is going through, and it sort of goes through that the very horrible and destructive path they have to go to reclaim that land.
Mhm.
But that's important to me because instead of losing our land, ultimately the goal is that we would get our land back.
Mhm.
So I think I would branch out there. I'm always going to do stuff that is close to my heart. So
Mhm.
we'll see. I'm not gonna say no to anything. I probably will never write a Western though. I'll just probably won't
Well,
go there.
is that because Pam told me that you are of the Muskogee Nation? So is that the sci-fi part of that? Is that coming from that part of your heart and not doing Westerns? Is that because of that as well, or is that different?
Oh no. Well, I think it would be very hard because like how would you do that without I don't know. Maybe it's because I have too many old westerns built up in my head where like Native Americans are put in a terrible light, or even like in the movies, like a white man is the native and he's just been painted, right? Like,
Mhm.
or yeah. So I don't know if I could ever do that justice. Like, how could I turn that on its head to empower the minority? I don't know, but for sci-fi, for the storyline is what is close to my heart for that one. It's set in the sci-fi world because I don't know why. I had this idea that I just had this image of Gemma waking up one day to these silver ships in the air over her planet, and she knew that her conqueror had come.
Mhm.
And I just thought how terrifying that had to have been for my people who are so far, are so, honestly, generationally so far down the line from me, but how terrifying
Mhm.
that we got to the point where hardly any of our culture exists in our family.
Mhm.
That's
That's
kind
so
of
sad.
close to my heart.
Yeah. Well, there's, obviously parts that you can write about and, might not want to.
Yeah.
Um, so, what are you currently reading?
What am I currently reading? I don't read a lot when I'm writing, which is why I'm like, oh God, I don't know. Let me look at what I just downloaded. Um, I just downloaded To Bleed a Crystal Bloom by Sarah A. Parker, she's an indie author,
Mhm.
and so I've heard good things about that. So eventually I will read that, and then I'm still reading A Cursed Kiss by Jenny Hickman, which is
Mhm.
really cool, like Gaelic new adult fantasy. So I'm excited to read that. I'm just really slow, and it's harder for me to read when I have to write A Game of Retribution in 2 months. So I probably won't finish either of those for like 2 months. Like in 2 months, I'll get it. But check those out,
Oh,
definitely.
definitely. Yeah, that sounds great. So we're just about out of time, and out of question, out of like attendee questions. I have a bunch more, but so I don't want to keep you. But I do want to know, like you said that Adrian and Isolde will be a trilogy.
Yes, right now, I think so. A lot
Okay.
of times I don't know until I start writing the book. Like I remember thinking that A Touch of Darkness would be a trilogy, and then I started writing Malice, and what I thought was the beginning was the ending. I should have known. I always start with the ending, and then I thought I don't have enough space for another. Like I have to put this in another book. I guess I
Hmm.
could have written a tomb or whatever, but I
Yeah.
don't do that. So yeah, so I'm pretty sure, but we'll see. If I feel like I want to give myself more time to do the story justice, then I will do that. So
Mhm. Well, I think you know this as a librarian that when you have a really big book, the audiobook is this big.
yeah, I know. Don't you love those? And I have to say, like, I always crack up at audiobook covers. If you've ever seen a physical audiobook in person, I don't know why the covers are always so bad, but I think they're so terrible. They
Why don't
very
they just use the
rarely
book
match
one?
the actual book. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know.
So,
We moved away from physical audiobooks a lot. We had some, but we moved primarily away because you have Overdrive, which is so fantastic. You can put it on your phone.
mhm.
And so,
Yeah, I use
life space saver.
I know, all of those digital ones I use all the time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for this. I know you're not feeling great, but I really appreciate answering all of my questions and all of our questions so
Yeah.
thoroughly. And
I don't know if thorough is the right word. But I appreciate these questions. They were different than what I usually get. And I love, so what the elements that I love to writing is that I think so many women in romance are so intelligent, and people, because they have so many preconceived ideas about what romance is, they don't assume we're intelligent women. And so I love when people talk to me about the deeper meaning. Of course, I have a degree in English, so it's like my jam. But what's interesting is I don't write with the intent. I don't know that I completely write with that intention, but reflecting on it, you can just see all the threads that from your life and society that you sort of fold into your writing. And it's really cool to be asked these questions. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I've really learned so much. And I have to say that last year we had a panel on All Roads Lead to Romance, it was called, and it was authors who had had different careers before they became romance writers. And
they're all lawyers.
We had a technology guru, and we had a professor, and we had, I mean, it was really interesting. Yeah, because you're right.
Remember, and we have a senator. Is she a senator or representative?
Yes, Stacey Abrams.
Yeah.
She's
and
running
people
for
are
governor.
like, throw that out there like it's a bad thing. And I'm like, no, that's like the most badass. Like being a romance author and then like, you know, being a woman in politics is the most badass thing you could ever do.
That's right. I mean, we take our words to the streets, man.
Well, and then you kind of know, like for her, I can't believe I forgot Stacey Abrams. She was at I think she was she at PLA when I went? She was at one of my like a big library conference I went to. But you know, it's a woman who writes romance is going to stand up for women's rights in office. And that's absolutely pretty great. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we should all be going out there and burning our bras or wearing our bras or whatever we're going to do with them.
Do whatever you want.
Exactly. Oh, well, again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for everybody who came. Remember, I put the link for Bank Square Books in the chat. Feel free to order books from Scarlett. Like I said, her most current one, The King of Blood and Battle and Blood. These are gonna get me. Battle and Blood.
I mean, I think we know, from reading it why it's titled that, but I do think people are like, the covers, I guess the covers look similar. Some people think to From Blood and Ash, and it confuses people, but.
Oh, I have one more question. I'm sorry. I was going into my end spiel, but I have to ask you, when did you start doing makeup tutorials on Instagram? Because I love them.
I've always actually done makeup. I love makeup. I'm not wearing them a lot right now because I have pink eye. Like I have this cold and I have pink eye too. And like I don't know if it's I don't know, but so I started doing makeup years ago. And I was one of those people in high school who did my makeup. Like I had winged eyeliner and everything. And like in the early 2000s, when everyone was wearing white eyeshadow, like I was wearing neutrals. And I distinctly remember this girl being like, yeah, you can come over to my house and we'll give you a makeover. And I was like, I already wear makeup. It's fine. And she's like, yeah, but like mine. And she had like the ice white eyeshadow. But I wanted to do this series called like Modern Goddess Makeup, and with everything that's gone on, I put it on the back burner, but I'm getting back into it. So I'm glad that you like it. It's a good outlet for me. It's one of my only other hobbies. So
you should have seen me putting my makeup on tonight. I was just like, ooh, I'm going to see Scarlett.
And I'm like, minimalistic because pink eye, but
I wear eyeshadow, which I never do, because you had just done the thing with the eyeshadow.
I love it so much. I'm someone, my friends always want me to do their makeup, and I always think, oh my God, I hope I can do a good job because I can do it on myself, but can I do this on another person? But I love it. It's that's another thing that women get bashed for on the internet, especially. They're like, oh, if you want to know what they really look like, take them swimming on a first date. And I'm like, you know what? Like, you guys can just fuck off. It is I think makeup enhances your beauty, and I don't think people wear it to mask, like, themselves. I think we wear it because we love it and that we wear it for ourselves. I'm not wearing makeup for anyone else but me.
Well,
So
I'm wearing
if
it
you
for
think it's
you.
for you, you're really vain.
No, I am wearing it for you, but I
I
wanted to
love
show off.
it. You're beautiful. I think it's great.
Oh, well, you've given me so much, books and sex, and not given me, but you know what I mean, and makeup and all of that. It just, you were like like the Renaissance woman of fantasy romance. So thank you so much.
Very sweet. Thank you.
And as a librarian, I'm thrilled, absolutely, that you are writing and that you bring the librarian perspective to what you do. So
Thank you.
I'm so impressed.
Once a librarian, always a librarian. It's so
Yes, you
true.
cannot get out of the club.
No,
Once you take that
no.
pinky swear.
It's like you think about everything from the perspective of being a librarian. So, especially in the book world.
Yeah, absolutely. So have a great night, and I really look forward to the next book, and I will definitely be reading your backlist because they just sound amazing.
Well, thank you and enjoy. I hope everyone has a good night.
All right. Bye, everybody.